Dr. Kemp is the Associate Director for the Rare Disease Program in the Office of New Drugs in FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Prior to joining the FDA in 2012, Dr. Kemp spent 8 years at NIH with a focus on neuroscience research, working to understand the genetics of neuropsychiatric disease and developing translational approaches and therapeutics to study these disorders. He did postgraduate training in psychiatry at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins before moving to the NIH for fellowship. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Kemp with us today, as he is a key official in the review of drug products for rare diseases like XLH.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to see so many people here in Baltimore. As this audience probably well recognizes, rare diseases are a very important aspect of public health, which is why we actually have a rare diseases program at the FDA, because 30 million people in the United States are actually affected with rare diseases. That means it's about 1 out of 10 people are actually affected. 80% of these are actually genetic disorders and are clinical, progressive, and have life-limiting aspects of the disorders. And the third point, I actually heard several of you talking about just as before the session started, that part of the problem, like with XLH, is that the presentations are heterogeneous. That's sort of the fancy scientific way to say that everybody has slightly different disease. So it's very hard to develop drugs, particularly for these sort of disorders, because some people are affected with the hearing loss, some affected with growth and bone disorders. It doesn't make it nice and easy like treating blood sugar and diabetes or something like that. When you look at the 7,000 rare disorders, we still have quite a bit of work to do, even though this community does have some products that have been developed about. That's part of the 5% that actually of the rare diseases actually have a treatment. And so you're a little bit on the cutting edge, as far as I can tell, of folks who now have to start thinking about second generation drugs and what do you want next, and then augmenting them and continuing the curve so that your all's children don't have the same problems that you had to deal with. A lot of this is being driven by the continued advocacy by patient groups such as yours. Why do we do patient-focused drug development? So the patient's input is probably one of the most important things, and this has been more recognized by legislators and the regulators in the drug and device industry. You don't necessarily want a drug that isn't right for you, doesn't address the things that are most important for you all. Patients all have different perspectives, right? What affects one person is not necessarily the thing that's most important to the next person. And part of having patient-focused drug development is to capture everyone's voice and in the survey method, get the full spectrum of what's going on with people and sort of get a maximum saturation of that information, because you don't necessarily want drug development just being driven by a couple people who are the most vocal within your community. We really want to hear from all of you. And this helps the FDA when we have to come and do a risk-benefit analysis for new drugs. We base our risk-benefit analysis on the information that we know about from your community, and especially in rare communities, sometimes that information isn't really well known or documented. You're going to have a series of questions, presumably today, where you are going to be asked what are your most bothersome symptoms and disease complications. What are the short-term and the long-term aspects that affect these disorders affect your lives? What is your experience with existing treatments? How do they affect you? How could they be improved? What is preventing you from actually using some of them? And then also, what is your own personal risk tolerance? What are you willing to do? Obviously, many people have had some pretty serious surgeries who have this disorder. And that has huge impacts on the way that you've had to grow up and live your lives. What is currently an unmet medical need within your community? Where do you actually need drugs or other therapies to be approved? And then also, what is your own personal preferences? The patient perspective is important throughout the drug development process. So it's very important to get the input early, before drugs are actually on the market, before development programs have started, so that they design their programs for you with your own personal priorities built in. So when decisions are being made about what drugs and formulations should be developed, what you would all perhaps want, what the endpoints are actually going to be in the drug studies, that when you have a heterogeneous disorder, everybody comes sometimes with their own endpoint. And how do you balance that in the drug development program? What is the drug actually going to do, and how are we going to measure it is a huge problem within drug development. So sometimes the information that comes out of these meetings is actually very helpful to the drug developers in order to decide what they're going to measure it within this. So it's just not height or whatever, but it's actually things that impact your life. Also, they're very important in sort of the post-marketing period, where you can identify gaps and safety risks that came out of the medications. And also, they provide a means in some communities to provide communication about what to expect if you try a different kind of drug, which I'm sure this community has already had with your previous treatments, with the surgeries and what to expect. And I'm sure this community is already sort of well familiar with that. So it's going to be an evolving conversation that you all have as new drugs come out for you. So we get asked frequently, how do people engage with the FDA in sort of a meaningful fashion? And this became such a focus that one of our authorization legislations for the FDA, what we call PDUFA, they actually had a requirement for these meetings. And so the FDA was committed to this and it started hosting several of these meetings, and then also provide input to groups, because obviously we can't do all 7,000, but we can provide a structure and a framework for folks to be able to do this within their own community, so you can design the drug development for yourselves in the direction that you want it. More recently, we have developed a guidance. For the first one out of a series of 4 guidances has come out that helps advise groups who are going to be doing patient-focused drug development how to do this sort of survey method in the most sort of scientific means in order to capture the full range of symptoms that people have, the full range of needs and demographic issues, so that it's just not like growth. Like we heard at the beginning, it's just not growth or maybe hearing, but like people have a lot of issues within this community that should be captured, and their experiences with those that you all want to be addressed in some sort of manner. And there's also been a lot of innovation in these. The ways that people are collecting this data, like it seems like you all are sort of on the forefront of this. You've already had surveys that have gone out electronically to sample what you might want to talk about, and this goes into clinical designs and incorporating the patient perspective and preferences, where we can count every patient, so that drug studies aren't just being developed for one small sliver of your community, but they can include everybody, and everybody can benefit as they go into new experimental drugs. I look forward to hearing the rest of this conference, and it looks like it's going to be a good one from what I was looking at the schedule.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.